The room had 22 chairs around that table and only 9 of them were filled. That detail stuck with me the whole drive home. 13 empty chairs. Like the company couldn't even be bothered to send enough people to fire me properly. I'd built the fraud detection core that processed over $4 billion in daily transactions for Viridian Financial. 9 years. I came in when they were a scrappy fintech startup operating out of a converted warehouse in Waterloo, Ontario, and I stayed through 3 funding rounds, 2 acquisitions, and 1 pandemic. I watched the headcount go from 41 people to over 800. I remember when our CEO used to bring Tim Hortons for the whole floor on Friday mornings. I remember when we celebrated our first $1 million contract with Stall brand sparkling wine in paper cups. By the time they let me go, nobody was bringing Tim Hortons to anyone. My name is Adrian, and I'm 51 years old, and on a grey Tuesday morning in October, the chief operating officer of the company I'd helped build looked me in the eye across that mahogany table and told me my position was being restructured. His name was Roger Holt. He'd been with the company 14 months. Before Viridian, he'd worked in luxury hotel management. I'm not being unkind, that was literally his background. Hotels. And somehow, he'd landed a COO role at a fintech firm because he knew how to cut costs, and cutting costs was all the board cared about in the lead-up to our IPO. I should back up. When I joined Viridian in 2015, I wasn't an employee in the traditional sense. Our CEO. A sharp, exhausted woman named Beverly, who drank too much coffee and laughed too loud and was one of the most genuinely brilliant people I've ever met. She brought me on as an independent contractor to solve a specific problem. Their transaction monitoring system was throwing false positives at a rate that was making enterprise clients walk. 3 major banks had already passed on partnerships because of it. I spent 4 months building something from scratch, a machine learning framework that could model behavioral patterns across account clusters and flag anomalies with a false positive rate under 1%. At the time, nothing on the market came close. Beverly called it the engine under the hood. She was right. Every product Viridian sold for the next 9 years ran on some version of what I built in those 4 months. Here's the part that Roger Holt apparently never read in any document anyone handed him. I never transferred ownership of that IP. Beverly and I had an agreement from day one. I licensed the core algorithm to Viridian exclusively. They could use it, improve the interface, build products on top of it, white label it to clients. But the foundational IP, the framework, the detection logic, the patent filed in my name in 2016, that remained mine. In exchange, I received a significantly below-market salary plus a licensing fee that scaled with the company's transaction volume. As Viridian grew, so did my quarterly payments. It was a good arrangement for everyone. Beverly understood it completely. Every general counsel the company ever had understood it. The licensing agreement was renewed in 2018 and again in 2021, each time clearly restating my ownership. Roger Holt, apparently, had never read it. When Beverly stepped back from the CEO role 18 months before my termination, health reasons, burnout, the kind of quiet exit that deserves more acknowledgement than it got, the new leadership team started treating the algorithm like it was a company asset, like it was something they owned outright. I noticed it in small ways at first. The way Roger would say, "our technology" in board presentations. The way the product team stopped looping me into architectural decisions, the way my access to certain internal systems was quietly downgraded. I raised it with the new general counsel, a man named Stuart, who always seemed to be running slightly late for something. He said he'd look into it. He never got back to me. I should have pushed harder. I know that now. Instead, I kept showing up. I kept doing my job, managing my small team of 4 engineers, maintaining the core system, flagging risks that Roger didn't understand and therefore dismissed. I told myself it would sort itself out. I told myself that when the IPO happened and the lawyers did their full diligence, the ownership structure would become impossible to ignore. What I didn't anticipate was that Roger would decide to eliminate the ambiguity by eliminating me. The call came on a Monday evening. Stuart asked me to come in Tuesday morning for a brief alignment meeting. No agenda. Just a time and a room number. I'd been in the industry long enough to know what that meant, but I told myself I was being paranoid. I wasn't. There were 9 people in that room. Roger sat at the head of the table. Stuart was there, a stack of folders in front of him. HR, a woman from the board I'd met twice, a few faces I didn't recognize, which I later learned were from the external advisory firm Roger had brought in to manage the pre-IPO restructuring. Roger spoke for about 4 minutes. He talked about operational efficiencies and the evolving needs of the organization and realigning talent with strategic priorities. He said my role as head of core infrastructure was being eliminated. He thanked me for my contributions. I remember looking at the window behind him. It was raining, that thin October rain that can't quite decide if it wants to be sleet. A Canada goose was walking across the parking lot below with tremendous purpose. When Roger finished, he slid a folder across the table. Severance package, 3 months, an NDA, a non-disparagement clause, a checkbox where I could indicate whether I wanted a reference letter. I opened the folder. I read the first page slowly. I turned to the second page. I read that slowly too. Then I closed the folder and looked at Roger and said, "I appreciate your time." I stood up, shook his hand, and walked out. Stuart followed me into the hallway. He looked uncomfortable, which was fair because he should have been. He asked me if I had any questions. I told him I'd be in touch through my lawyer. He nodded and said that was completely understandable. He went back into the room. I took the elevator down to the lobby, nodded at the security desk, a guy named Wendell who'd worked there for 6 years and always asked about my daughter, and walked out into the parking lot. I sat in my car for a while. The goose was gone. Then I called my lawyer. Her name is Christine, and she's been my legal counsel since 2014, and she's one of those rare people who makes you feel calmer the moment you hear her voice. I walked her through what had happened. She asked me a few questions. Then she said, very quietly, "Adrian, they have no idea what they just did." I said, "I know." She said, "Do not sign anything. Do not respond to anything. Let it all come to me." I said, "Understood." She paused. "Also, do you want to just win or do you want to really win?" I told her I wanted to really win. Here's what Roger and Stuart and everyone in that room had failed to understand. Without my licensing agreement, Viridian couldn't legally operate their core product. The fraud detection system that every one of their enterprise clients used, that was embedded in contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars, that was central to their entire IPO prospectus. They had a license to use it. That license was tied to an employment arrangement that they had just unilaterally terminated. Christine fired off a letter to Viridian's legal team within 48 hours. Polite, factual. It outlined the IP ownership structure, referenced the specific clauses in the licensing agreement, and noted that my termination had triggered a review period during which Viridian needed to either negotiate a new licensing arrangement or cease using the proprietary framework. The response came back in 3 days. It was aggressive. Their external lawyers claimed the algorithm had been substantially modified over 9 years and that the current version bore little resemblance to the original patent. They used phrases like joint development and work made for hire and de facto transfer of ownership through conduct. Christine called me after she read it. She said, "They're going to try to fight this." I said, "Let them." What followed was about 3 weeks of legal back and forth that I mostly experienced as a series of increasingly long emails that Christine would summarize for me on the phone. I went about my life. I spent more time at home than I had in years. My wife, who teaches high school mathematics and has the patience of a saint, kept asking me how I was doing. I kept saying I was fine. Eventually, she stopped asking and just started making sure there was good coffee in the house, which is its own kind of love. I took long walks. Lake Ontario in October is a different kind of beautiful, cold and grey and honest. I thought a lot about the 9 years I'd given to Viridian. I wasn't bitter exactly. I was something more complicated than bitter. I was clear-eyed. Meanwhile, I started having conversations. The first was with a colleague I'd known since my early career days, a man named Felix who now ran the technology strategy division at one of the 5 major chartered banks. We'd had lunch twice a year for a decade. I called him and said I was exploring some things and asked if we could talk. He said, "Absolutely, come by the office." I also reached out to someone I'd met at a conference in Vancouver 2 years earlier, a woman named Ingrid who ran a fintech consultancy that advised several major financial institutions. She'd seen my work in action. One of her clients was a Viridian customer, and she'd said at the time, "If you ever want to talk, let me know." I let her know. There was a third conversation with a US-based firm operating in Canada, but I'm getting ahead of myself. What I want to be clear about, and this matters, is that I wasn't acting out of revenge. I know that sounds like something people say, but I mean it in a practical sense. Revenge is a goal. My goal was a fair outcome. The two things overlapped, but they weren't the same. Felix's bank had been a Viridian client for 3 years. They licensed our fraud detection product. Felix told me, carefully and with appropriate institutional hedging, that there were ongoing concerns at the bank about Viridian's stability heading into the IPO. They'd heard rumors about leadership changes. They were watching. He also told me, less carefully, that the bank had been wanting to develop proprietary fraud detection infrastructure for a long time, something they owned outright, something that wasn't tied to a third-party vendor's fortunes. I told him I might be in a position to help with that. We had 2 more meetings over the following week. I brought Christine. They brought their legal team. We talked about what I had, what I owned, what was possible. Ingrid's conversations were different in tone but parallel in substance. Her consultancy had 3 clients who were also Viridian customers. She understood the dependency issue acutely. She understood what it would mean for those clients if Viridian's ownership structure came apart during an IPO process. She asked me at one point what I was looking for. I told her I wanted to be fairly compensated for something I'd built. I wanted to continue working on the technology in a context where I had real authority, and I wanted to build it properly, the way it should have been built, without a hotel manager telling me what the market needed. She laughed. She said she knew exactly who I should talk to. 3 weeks after I walked out of that room, Christine called me at 8 in the morning. She said Viridian had made an offer. They wanted to negotiate a new licensing arrangement. They were offering a buyout of the full IP, a one-time payment plus an advisory role. The number they offered was significant. I won't pretend it wasn't. But Christine said, before you respond, I want you to hear what else is on the table. What was on the table? Felix's bank was prepared to acquire the full IP outright, no licensing, full ownership transfer, for a number that was roughly twice what Viridian was offering, plus a 5-year consulting agreement and a role building the internal team from scratch, with full hiring authority and a technology mandate that reported directly to their chief digital officer. And Ingrid had a third party, the US-based firm, that was interested in a licensing arrangement rather than outright acquisition, with quarterly royalties tied to implementation scale. The upside was potentially higher over time, but less certain. I took a few days. I went over everything with Christine. I talked to my wife, who asked good questions about the bankroll and whether I actually wanted to work inside a large institution again. I called my former colleague Priya, who'd been on my team at Viridian and had left 8 months before I was fired, and whose opinion I trusted on technical matters and human ones, both. She said, "Adrian, just make sure whatever you choose, you're building something." I went with the bank. The final number, by the time the transaction closed, was just over $400 million Canadian. That figure sounds larger than it felt in the moment, which I realize is an absurd thing to say, but the process of getting there was so methodical, so layered in document review and legal negotiation and technical due diligence, that the number itself almost became abstract. Christine, to her considerable credit, never let me lose sight of what it represented. It represented 9 years of work, properly valued. Finally, the closing happened on a Friday afternoon in a boardroom in downtown Toronto. There were lawyers and bankers and a lot of paper. When it was done, Christine and I went to a small Italian restaurant on King Street, where she ordered pasta, And I ordered the same because I couldn't focus on the menu, and we sat there for a while without saying very much. I paid for dinner. The following Monday, Viridian received formal notice that their license to operate the framework had been revoked, effective upon the completion of the IP transfer to the acquiring institution. Their legal team had 30 days to respond. Christine handled it. What happened at Viridian over the next several months? I know largely through second-hand accounts, former colleagues, industry contacts, the occasional article in the Globe and Mail's business section. The IPO process stalled. Without clear title to the core technology, their prospectus had a significant gap that underwriters couldn't get comfortable with. Several enterprise clients, once word got out about the IP situation, began reviewing their contracts. Two of them, both major credit unions, accelerated their migration planning. Roger Holt left the company 4 months after my termination. The board announced a leadership transition. Beverly, to her credit, had the grace not to comment publicly. I heard through Priya, who still had contacts there, that in the weeks after my termination, several members of my former team had approached Roger about the IP situation. They tried to explain the dependency. He told them the legal team was handling it. He'd told them the algorithm was a company asset and always had been. He'd told one of my engineers, a brilliant young woman who joined us straight from the University of Waterloo, that she didn't understand the business side of things. She left. 3 others followed her within a month. By the time Viridian understood the full scope of what they were dealing with, 5 of the 8 people who actually understood the core system at a deep level were gone. Priya herself joined me at the bank 6 months after my transition. I told her the door was open, and I meant it. She brought 2 colleagues with her. The team I'm building now is smaller than what I had at Viridian, but it's better. There's something about assembling a group of people who chose to come rather than people who just happened to be there. Every meeting feels different. There's a moment I think about sometimes. It was about 2 weeks before I got the offer from the bank, when everything was still in motion and the outcome wasn't certain. I was walking along the waterfront in Oakville, where my wife and I live, on a cold November morning. The lake was almost the same color as the sky, the pewter gray that makes the whole world feel like it's made of the same material. I had my hands in my pockets and I was thinking about risk, about whether I'd misread the situation, about whether Christine's confidence was warranted or just professional optimism. A man walked past me with a black Labrador, the dog moving with that happy, groundless enthusiasm that labs have, completely undisturbed by the cold or the grey or any uncertainty whatsoever. I remember thinking, that's the right posture. Just keep moving. Trust what you built. I went home and had coffee with my wife, and she was reading something at the kitchen table. And she looked up and said, "You look better." I said, "Yeah." She went back to reading. When my daughter called that evening, she's 23, lives in Vancouver, works in sustainable architecture, I told her things were looking good. She said, "Dad, I never doubted it." Then she asked if we were still coming for Christmas, and I said yes, absolutely, we wouldn't miss it. She said, "Good, bring the good coffee, not the airport stuff." I told her I would. The deal closed 3 weeks later. I don't spend much time thinking about Roger. He was a symptom, not the cause. The cause was a company that grew faster than its institutional memory, that brought in people who optimized for the metrics they understood and ignored the ones they didn't. That's not unusual. It happens everywhere. The difference, in my case, was that the thing they didn't understand happened to be the thing I'd spent 9 years being careful about. You can call that luck. You can call it foresight. Mostly, I think it was just the habit of reading what you sign. The framework is still running. It processes more transactions now than it ever did at Viridian. There's a team of 12 people working on it, and they're good, and they ask hard questions, and nobody has told any of them that they don't understand the business side. Beverly sent me a note a few months after everything settled, a short email, just a few lines. She said she'd heard I'd landed well. She said the early days were the best days, and she hoped I'd found a place that felt like that again. I wrote back and said I thought I had. I meant it. I keep coming back to those 13 empty chairs. Not because they hurt me. By the time I left that room, I was past hurt. But because they tell you everything about how Roger thought. He didn't think he needed to fill those chairs. He didn't think the meeting warranted that kind of attention, which means he didn't think I warranted it. And that assumption, that casual dismissal of someone he'd never actually tried to understand, is what cost him everything. There's a thing I've noticed about people who make decisions badly. It's not usually that they're unintelligent. Roger wasn't stupid. He was efficient in the ways his background had trained him to be efficient. The problem was that he mistook familiarity for understanding. He'd seen the product. He'd seen the revenue numbers. He'd sat in enough board presentations to feel like he knew what the engine looked like. He never once opened the hood. I spent 9 years being careful. Careful about the contract I signed in 2015. Careful about the renewals in 2018 and 2021. Careful about what I built and what I kept and what I licensed versus what I transferred. That care wasn't strategy in the beginning. It was just the habit of someone who'd learned early in his career that the details you skip over are usually the ones that matter most. You read what you sign. You know what you own. You don't assume goodwill will substitute for clarity. That's not cleverness. It's just integrity in the plainest sense, doing the unglamorous work honestly, consistently, even when nobody's watching and nobody's thanking you for it. What I think about most, honestly, is Christine's question. Do you want to just win, or do you want to really win? I've turned that over a lot since then. The difference between the two isn't about money or scope. It's about whether you're reacting or deciding. Reacting would have been signing Roger's severance package that same morning, going home angry, and spending the next year telling the story at dinner parties. Deciding meant slowing down enough to understand what I actually had, and then being patient while the right path became clear. That patience is harder than it sounds when you're sitting in your car in a parking lot in the rain, watching a goose walk somewhere with more certainty than you feel. But patience built on preparation is different from patience built on hope. I wasn't waiting for something to happen. I was letting what was already true become visible to the right people. And Priya's words, just make sure whatever you choose, you're building something. I've held on to those. Because the outcome of this story isn't really the $400 million or the role at the bank or the fact that Roger's no longer at Viridian. The outcome is the team I have now. 12 people who ask hard questions and don't get told they don't understand the business side. That's what I was working toward without fully knowing it. 9 years of doing honest work, keeping my agreements, and trusting that the foundation I'd laid would hold weight when it needed to. It held, not because the universe rewarded me, because the work was real, and I'd been careful enough to protect it. And when the moment came, I had the clarity to act on what I knew rather than what I feared. Beverly said the early days were the best days. I wrote back and said I thought I'd found that again. I meant the team. I meant the work. I meant the feeling of being in a room where everyone actually wants to be there. That's the thing worth building. Everything else is just the number on the closing documents.